Welcome to our rendition of 310 to Yuma, a classic Western short story written by Elmore Leonard. Published in 1953, it is one of the fantastic pieces that came out during the golden age of old Western American media. Now, it is generally regarded as a classic piece of American literature. Here is 310 to Yuma, retold in a narrative form. As the long night gave way to a misty morning, Deputy Marshal Paul Scallon guided his prisoner, Jim Kidd, toward the small town of Contention. Their journey had been grueling, hours spent in near silence, the rhythmic creak of saddles and the soft clip of hooves cutting through the stillness. The air was heavy with a damp fog, and Scallon, though exhausted, held his focus like a man gripping a lifeline. His shotgun lay snug across his lap, a silent promise of resolve. Ahead, the shadow of Contention grew sharper, the town's outlines emerging like shapes from a dream. This was not just a stop on the map, it was a staging ground for a gamble with death. Somewhere in between the first street of Contention and the 310 train to Yuma, Scallon had to ensure Kidd stayed his prisoner and didn't become the ward of justice by bullet or a clever escape. Even at the edge of the town, there was no relief. Contention's eerie stillness hinted at something brewing beneath its surface. As they approached the Republic Hotel, Scallon broke the silence. "End of the line," he muttered, more to himself than to Kidd. Kidd, young and weary with a grin that made him seem more devil-may-care than ruthless outlaw, turned in his saddle. He offered no resistance as Scallon directed him into the hotel. The outlaw's iron manacles clinked faintly with every step, and his calm demeanor carried a quiet threat. This wasn't over. The Republic Hotel loomed ahead, a weathered building with a crooked charm, its walls carrying stories only old structures could tell. Scallon pushed open the screen door, the hinges protesting with a creak. Inside, the air was heavy, with a faint scent of tobacco and stale whiskey. A smell that seemed to permeate every frontier town worth its salt. A man emerged from the shadows of the doorway, his face half hidden beneath a battered hat. "Are you the marshal?" the man asked, his voice low and unsure. Scallon corrected that he is actually the deputy. His tone was firm but unhurried, the voice of a man who had carried out enough arrests to know that words often carried as much weight as weapons. The man introduced himself as Timpy, a Wells Fargo agent, his presence marking the cooperative effort between lawmen and businesses in this lawless stretch of the West. Timpy's nervous energy was palpable, his hands fidgeting like a gambler unsure of his next card. Scallon wasn't surprised. Few men wanted to stand close to the fuse of danger, and Jim Kidd was a powder keg with a grin. As they climbed the creaking stairs to the room Timpy had secured, Scallon's eyes darted to every corner, every shadow. The hotel was quiet, but not too quiet. A man slumped in a chair near the lobby, his hat tipped low over his face. Looked like he'd been there for hours. Scallon's instincts prickled. Something about the man felt wrong, too still, too indifferent to the presence of armed lawmen escorting a prisoner. But Scallon didn't have the luxury of investigating. The room Timpy had chosen was on the second floor, overlooking Commercial Street. It wasn't much to look at. A narrow space with an iron bed, a rickety table, and a single window framed by a thin curtain. Scallon studied the layout with a soldier's precision. The window was both a risk and an opportunity, a portal for attack or escape, depending on who moved first. Scallon told Kid to get comfortable, motioning him to the bed, his grip on the shotgun never faltering. Kid obeyed, settling onto the mattress with the practiced ease of someone who has been handcuffed more times than he cared to count. For a moment, silence reigned. Kid glanced out the window at the street below, then back at Scallon. "Cold morning," he remarked, his tone light, almost conversational. But Scallon didn't like to be tested, and told Kid as such. His voice was low, steady, a man who meant every word. "You make a move, and I'll pull both triggers before you hit the floor." Kid's lips curled into a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You're a careful man, Marshal. I respect that." Scallon didn't answer. He dragged a chair to the table, positioning it so the shotgun rested squarely in his hands, pointed directly at Kid. For hours, they sat like that, two men locked in a battle of patience. Outside, contention began to stir. A rider appeared on the horizon, his silhouette framed by the pale light of day. He dismounted in front of a saloon, exchanged a few words with a figure on the porch, then disappeared into the shadows. Scallon watched from the window, his nerves tightening like a coiled spring. Contention wasn't a bustling town by any measure, but the quiet felt unnatural, like the calm before a storm. The man from earlier, the one slumped in the lobby chair, now stood across the street, leaning against a wooden post. He looked too casual, his thumbs hooked into his belts as if he were waiting for something, or someone. Scallon asked Kid if that was a friend of his, nodding towards the window. Kid leaned over, peering through the glass. His grin widened. "Charlie Prince," he said, as if mentioning an old acquaintance. "And where Charlie is, the rest aren't far behind." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Scallon felt the weight of them settle into his chest. He had known this job would be dangerous. He had been warned that Jim Kid had friends willing to do just about anything to set him free. Still, knowing was one thing. Seeing the danger materialize in the flesh was another. But Scallon loudly proclaimed that Charlie Prince and the rest of them being there doesn't change anything. He said that more for himself than for Kid. Scallon returned to his chair, his grip tightening on the shotgun. The hours dragged on, the sun creeping higher in the sky. Inside the room, the tension grew thicker with every passing minute. Kid, ever the opportunist, tried to poke holes in Scallon's resolve. Kid asked if he had a family, breaking the silence. Scallon's jaw tightened, and after a pause, told him that he had 3 kids. Kid whistled low. 3 kids? And you're risking it all for what? $150 a month? Men like you ought to be home with his wife, not playing babysitter to the likes of me. Scallon didn't answer. He knew what Kid was doing. Sowing doubt, testing the cracks in his armor. But Scallon had learned long ago that resolve wasn't about shutting out fear. It was about carrying it with you and moving forward anyways. Scallon replied, his voice flat, that Kid is wasting his breath. Kid smirked. We'll see. Noon came and went, marked only by the slight shift of light through the window and the distant sounds of contention. A horse's bray echoed faintly, followed by the clink of metal shoes against stone. But otherwise, the town remained unnervingly quiet. Scallon rolled another cigarette, the task giving his hands something to do, and offered one to Kid. The outlaw accepted with a nod, his handcuffed hands fumbling awkwardly with the paper and tobacco. For a moment, they smoked in silence, two men bound by circumstance, but separated by a chasm of morality. "It's funny," Kid said suddenly, breaking the silence. "You and me, we're not so different." Scallon raised an eyebrow. "That's so?" "Sure. You're just doing what you've got to do to get by, same as me. Only difference is you've got a badge to hide behind." Scallon exhaled a plume of smoke, letting the words hang in the air before answering. "Difference is, Kid, I'm not hiding. I'm just trying to do what's right." Kid chuckled, low and soft. "Well, right won't mean much if you're lying in the dirt. You think that badge makes you untouchable? You're just another man with a gun, Marshal, and there's always somebody faster." Scallon didn't respond, but his grip on the shotgun tightened. As the afternoon sun began its slow descent, the first real sign of trouble came. Scallon was at the window, scanning the street below, when he saw a group of riders approaching. 6 men on horseback, their silhouettes framed against the dusty horizon. They rode into town slowly, their movements deliberate, and reined in near the saloon. At their head was Charlie Prince, the man Kid had identified earlier. Charlie dismounted, dusting off his coat with an air of casual authority. The others followed suit, spreading out along the street like wolves circling their prey. Scallon muttered to Kid that his friends are here. Kid stood and moved to the window, his handcuffs rattling softly. He took one look at the scene below and grinned. "Told you they wouldn't leave me behind." Scallon stepped back from the window, his mind racing. He'd expect trouble, but the sight of the 6 men sent a cold knot twisting in his gut. He wasn't just up against one outlaw anymore. He was facing a pack. Down on the street, Charlie Prince cupped his hands around his mouth and called out, "Jim!" His voice echoed through the quiet town, carrying with it a mix of confidence and menace. Kid leaned out the window, his grin widening. "I'm here, Charlie. Hold tight." Prince shouted back, "We'll be waiting. Just say the word." Scallon pulled Kid away from the window roughly. "Don't push your luck." Kid laughed. "What are you gonna do, Marshal? Shoot me? That won't stop them. Hell, it'll just make 'em mad." Scallon didn't reply. He returned to the window, keeping his movements cautious and deliberate. Below, the outlaws had taken up positions along the street, their hands resting on their guns. They weren't making a move, yet. They were waiting for the 3:10 train to Yuma, same as Scallon. But their plan was clear. When that train arrived, they would make their play. As the clock ticked closer to 3, the tension in the room became unbearable. Scallon paced near the door, his shotgun never far from his grasp. Kid sat on the bed, watching him with a mix of amusement and curiosity. "You know," Kid said, his tone casual, "you could just let me go. Walk out of here, tell your bosses I overpowered you. No one would blame you. Not with those odds." Scallon shot him back a withering look. Not a chance. Kid leaned back, shaking his head. "Suit yourself, but I've got to say, you're either the bravest lawman I've ever met, or the dumbest." Scallon didn't answer. He didn't have to. Every fiber of his being was focused on one goal: getting Jim Kidd to that train. At 5 minutes to 3, Scallon made his decision. He stood, the shotgun in his hands, and motioned for Kidd to rise. Time to go. Kidd obeyed, his movements slow and deliberate. The manacles clinked as he stood, the sound echoing faintly in the small room. Scallon unlocked the door and stepped into the hallway, his senses on high alert. They descended the stairs and crossed the lobby, Scallon's eyes darting to every shadow, every potential threat. When they stepped out onto the street, the afternoon sun hit them like a hammer, its brightness amplifying the sense of exposure. "Left on Stockman," Scallon said, his voice low but firm. "Keep walking." Kidd did as he was told, his movements calm and unhurried. The two men walked side by side, the narrow street stretching out before them like a gauntlet. Ahead, the train station loomed, its low building framed by the shimmering heat of the afternoon. The outlaws watched from the shadows, their eyes following Scallon and Kidd's every move. Charlie Prince stood near the saloon, his pistols holstered, but his hands twitching, ready to draw. Scallon's heart pounded in his chest, the weight of the shotgun a small comfort against the overwhelming odds. He knew this walk could be his last, but he also knew he couldn't turn back. The street felt like a stage set for an unseen audience, the muted bustle of contention replaced by a silence so absolute it seemed to press down on Scallon and Kidd. Every step they took along Stockman Street felt measured, as though the ground beneath them had turned to glass. The 3 blocks to the station stretched like miles. Kidd walked ahead, his pace steady, his handcuffed hands swaying lightly. He carried himself with a confidence that didn't match his situation, as if the sight of his comrades watching from the shadows was enough to reassure him that he wouldn't be leaving contention in shackles. Scallon, on the other hand, moved with a deliberate wariness, his grip on the shotgun firm. He scanned the porches and alleys, catching fleeting glimpses of the outlaws who had ridden into town hours earlier. Their faces remained mostly obscured by the low brims of their hats, but their intent was clear enough in the way they lingered, still as statues, but ready to explode into action. Though no words passed between Scallon and his prisoner, there was an unspoken battle playing out. Scallon's determination to see the job through clashed with Kidd's quiet, almost smug confidence that things would fall in his favor. Up ahead, the train station finally came into view, its low, sprawling architecture bathed in the glare of the afternoon sun. The train itself was already there, a hulking iron beast belching steam that drifted skyward in wisps. The deputy felt a small flicker of hope. They were close now, closer than he had expected to get when he first saw the riders gather. From the corner of his eye, Scallon spotted movement beneath a wooden awning. The gang had begun to close in. Charlie Prince, the wiry man Kidd had identified earlier, emerged from the shadows with a casual ease that belied the situation. His pistols hung at his hips like extensions of his arms, and though he didn't draw, the threat was implicit. The rest of the outlaws fanned out along the street, their numbers filling the gaps between buildings. Scallon felt their eyes on him, their stares like the pull of gravity. He tightened his grip on the shotgun, but his pace didn't falter. If fear gnawed at him, he didn't let it show. As they passed the edge of the saloon, Prince stepped forward. He called out, his voice carrying the kind of easy authority that only came with confidence. Though Scallon couldn't make out the exact words, he didn't need to. Prince was demanding Kid's release. That much was clear from his posture and the way his hand hovered near his gun. Kid stopped walking and turned slightly, his expression almost playful, as though the situation were nothing more than an elaborate game. Scallon barked an order, his voice cutting through the tension like a whip, and Kid reluctantly continued towards the station. The final steps to the platform were the hardest. The gang had made their move, stepping fully into view and closing the distance. Scallon could feel the heat of their presence, like fire at his back. They were in the open now, with nothing but the platform's expanse separating them from the train. The iron beast hissed and groaned, the sounds echoing against the wooden buildings. Scallon knew he had no time to waste. If they lingered, if they hesitated for even a moment, the outlaws would seize their chance. Prince shouted again, his voice louder this time, and Scallon could feel the weight of the ultimatum. The man was daring him to take another step, to defy the odds and risk everything. Scallon didn't look back. He pressed his shotgun harder against Kid's back, forcing him up the platform steps. The outlaws didn't follow. Not yet. They held their ground, watching with a predator's patience, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Scallon's breath came in short bursts as they neared the train. He guided Kid towards the mail car, his mind racing through scenarios. Behind him, he could hear the faint creak of boots on the platform, the sound of men positioning themselves for what was to come. Suddenly, the gang sprang into action. Their footsteps thundered across the planks as they surged forward, and Scallon felt a shift in the air. A palpable crack of tension breaking. He didn't turn. Instead, he shoved Kid towards the mail car's open door, his voice rising above the chaos to issue a final warning. The first shot rang out like a thunderclap. It wasn't clear who fired, but the echo of the gunshot set the scene ablaze. The gang drew their weapons, and Scallon knew he had no choice. He swung the shotgun around, the motion instinctive, and fired both barrels into the crowd. The scatter of buckshot hit its mark, sending one of the men sprawling. Charlie Prince, undeterred, charged forward, his pistols blazing. Scallon dropped the shotgun and drew his Colt in one fluid motion, his training taking over. He fired again and again, each shot aimed with precision. The gang faltered. Prince went down, clutching his chest, and the others hesitated, their momentum shattered. Scallon didn't wait. He grabbed Kid by the collar and dragged him onto the train, their bodies slamming against the metal as they scrambled inside. The train jolted to life, its wheels grinding against the rails as it began to pull away from the station. Scallon leaned against the wall of the mail car, his chest heaving with exertion. Kid laid sprawled out on the floor, his handcuffs glinting in the dim light. The outlaws didn't follow. They lingered on the platform, their guns lowered, their expressions dark. The train gathered speed, the town of contention shrinking behind them. For the first time in hours, Scallon allowed himself a moment of relief. The job was done. Against impossible odds, he had succeeded. Kid, lying on the floor, looked up at him with an expression that was equal parts annoyance and respect. Though the outlaw said nothing, his silence spoke volumes. Scallon, exhausted but victorious, allowed himself a small smile. The train thundered onward, leaving contention behind, carrying both of them toward Yuma and whatever came next. Our next story tonight is another classic cowboy western tale that came out in the 50s. This one is called The Gift of Cochise, written by Louis Amour, published 1952. Here is The Gift of Cochise. The sun beat down mercilessly on the solitary cabin in West Dog Canyon, its walls standing defiant against the expanse of Apache country. Angie Lowe stood in the doorway, her shoulders squared, her hands gripping a double-barreled shotgun. Beside her were her children, Jimmy, 7, and Jane, 5, their wide eyes darting between their mother and the figures on horseback before them. 12 Apaches sat astride their calico ponies, their faces impassive, but their presence changed the air with an unspoken threat. At their head was a man whose name carried weight across the frontier, Cochise. His black eyes, sharp and unreadable, scanned the cabin, the land, and the women who had turned away his warriors 3 times. For weeks, Angie had been living on the edge of survival, defending her home against Apache raids. The men she faced were hardened fighters, their skills honed against the finest soldiers the U.S. Army could muster. Yet this lone woman with her children had held her ground, sending 7 of their number to the next life. Now, Cochise himself had come to see this woman who dared stand against him. The standoff stretched, the silence heavy with possibility. Cochise broke it first, his voice calm but edged with curiosity. He asked where her husband was. Angie, her voice steady despite her fear, told him that Ed had gone to El Paso. Cochise's gaze lingered, measuring the truth in her words. Then, after a pause, he stated what she had dreaded. Her husband was dead. Angie's chest tightened, but she didn't let it show. She had suspected as much, though hearing it from Cochise, spoken as if it were fact, made it real in a way she hadn't wanted to face. Cochise pressed her further, questioning why she stayed in such a perilous place. Angie straightened, defiance flashing in her eyes. This was her home, her land. The spring, the garden, the small herd of cattle, they were all she had left, and she would not abandon them. The Apache leader listened, his expression unreadable. Angie reminded him that there were other springs nearby, places his people could drink. Her words carried a subtle challenge, a reminder that she would fight again if necessary. Cochise seemed amused by her resolve. He turned his attention to young Jimmy, noting the boy's sturdy frame. Did the boy shoot too? Angie, her pride swelling despite the tension, declared that he did. She gestured towards a distant prickly pear and handed Jimmy the Winchester. The boy steadied the rifle against the doorframe, just as his father had taught him, and fired. The top of the cactus exploded in a burst of pulp and spines. The Apache warriors murmured in approval, and even Cochise allowed himself a faint chuckle. He told Angie she had no need for a man. She was raising warriors herself. But Angie, her voice steady, reminded him that she sought no war with his people. Her words carried an edge of dignity, a veiled accusation that the great Cochise shouldn't be making war on women and children. Cochise regarded her in silence, then turned his pony and gestured his men to follow. As they rode away, Angie called after him, demanding the return of her stolen ponies. Cochise didn't answer. That night, as darkness crept over the canyon, Angie sat alone by her fire. Her hands trembled as the adrenaline ebbed, but her resolve did not falter. The next morning, she found her ponies returned, grazing in the corral. It wasn't a peace offering, but a sign, a promise that the Apaches would trouble her no more. The days stretched into weeks, each one marked by hard labor and quiet determination. Angie cut hay, planted crops, and cared for her children with the unyielding strength of someone who had no choice but to endure. There were signs that she was not alone. Moccasin tracks appeared near the spring, and once she caught sight of an Apache girl drawing water. Instead of hostility, Angie offered the girl a red ribbon, a gesture that was met with silent acceptance. The next morning, a quarter of antelope was left on her doorstep. Even as she found small comforts, the weight of her isolation grew heavier. She knew now that Ed was never coming back, yet leaving the canyon was not an option. This land was her home, and as long as she stayed, Cochise's presence shielded her from other raiders. Angie's life in West Dog Canyon had started with hope. She and Ed had chosen the spot together, drawn by the promise of fertile soil, ample water, and the protective embrace of the cliffs. The house had been built on the ruins of an old Spanish settlement, its thick walls and strategic position offering a sense of security. But Ed had never truly belonged in the wilderness. He was a man of easy charm and restless habits, better suited to the bustling saloons of Santa Fe than the lonely expanse of Apache country. When he rode to El Paso for supplies, Angie suspected he was seeking more than just seed and ammunition. She hadn't expected him to stay away forever, but deep down, she wasn't surprised when he didn't return. What Angie didn't know was the truth of Ed's fate. In a saloon far from home, he had intervened in a deadly quarrel, his easy smile masking the steel beneath. Ed Lowe had saved the life of a man named Chess Lane, stepping into a fight he couldn't win. Though he fell to the Tolliver brothers' guns, his last thoughts were of Angie and the children he'd left behind. As Angie clung to her life in the canyon, Chess Lane was searching for her. Driven by a sense of debt to the man who had saved him, he scoured the desert, battling Apaches and enduring the brutal elements. His journey became the stuff of legend, whispered among the tribes as they watched the relentless rider carve a path through the wilderness. After months of searching, Chess Lane found himself at the edge of West Dog Canyon. His arrival, bountiful and battered as the captive of Cochise, marked the beginning of a new chapter in Angie's life. It was a warm, quiet Sunday when Chess Lane first laid eyes on West Dog Canyon. Angie sat beneath the shade of a towering cottonwood tree, the Bible open on her lap, her children playing in the yard. The morning had passed in quiet industry, and now the stillness felt like a reward, a brief respite from the constant effort of survival. When Jimmy tugged at her sleeve, Angie barely registered his words at first, but as she looked up, her heart skipped. Cochise was approaching, his warriors trailing behind like shadows. At their center, a stranger sat slumped in his saddle, his hands bound to the horn, his feet tied beneath the horse. The man was a mess, a sun-darkened figure whose clothes hung in tatters and whose face bore the grim of weeks on the trail. His eyes, though, were sharp, gleaming with defiance. Even bound, he held himself with a quiet dignity, as if daring the world to break him. Cochise stopped his horse a few yards from the cabin and gestured towards the prisoner. His words were simple, but heavy with meaning. The Apache leader declared that Angie had no man to protect her, so he had brought her one. This man was a warrior, strong and capable, a gift from Cochise himself. Angie stared, her emotions colliding in a whirlwind of shock, embarrassment, and something she couldn't quite name. The stranger, catching the faint humor in her expression, managed a smile. He introduced himself as Chess Lane, his tone carrying a rough gentleness that softened the edges of his worn exterior. The Apaches, satisfied with their offering, whooped and rode off, leaving Angie alone with the stranger. For a moment, she felt the full weight of the situation. This man, battered and bloodied, had been thrust into her life without warning, and she wasn't sure what to make of it, or him. Practicality won out over awkwardness. Angie untied Chess's hands, her movements brisk but careful. His wrists were raw from the bindings, and she felt a pang of sympathy despite herself. She offered him water and motioned towards the basin where he could wash. Chess, though worn down by his ordeal, wasted no time cleaning himself up. He shaved with the razor he found by the door, one that had belonged to Ed, and splashed water over his face. By the time he sat down at Angie's table for dinner, he looked like a different man. The children stared at him, wide-eyed and silent. It had been so long since a man sat at their table that his presence felt almost surreal. Angie, too, found herself unsettled. She busied herself serving food, her hands moving automatically, but her thoughts were a tangle of questions. Who was this man? Why had Cochise chosen to spare him? And what would his presence mean for their fragile existence here? Chess, for his part, ate with the enthusiasm of a man who hadn't had a proper meal in weeks. He didn't speak much, though, and Angie was grateful for it. The silence gave her time to think, to process the strange turn her life had taken. After dinner, Chess unrolled his bedroll in the barn, where the hay offered a soft enough place to sleep. But as the evening deepened, he found himself drawn back to the cabin. He sat on the lowest step of the porch, his presence a quiet reassurance in the fading light. Angie joined him after putting the children to bed. The two sat in companionable silence, watching as the last traces of sunlight slipped beyond the canyon walls. A lone quail called out from the brush, its plaintive song carrying through the stillness. Chess broke the silence first, his voice low and reflective. He spoke of the land, of how a man could grow to love a place like this if he had a chance. Angie didn't answer, but his words stirred something in her. She had loved this land once, before it became a place of loneliness and survival. Now, sitting beside this stranger, she felt the faint stirrings of that old connection. Chess didn't leave the next day, or the day after that. His presence quickly became a part of the rhythm of life in the canyon. He helped Angie with the heavy work, repairing fences, cutting hay, and scouting the surrounding land for any trouble. The children warmed to him almost immediately, following him around with wide-eyed curiosity. Jimmy, especially, took to Chess, watching him with a hero-like worship that Angie found both endearing and bittersweet. Though Angie tried to maintain a sensible distance, it became harder with each passing day. Chess was quiet but capable, his actions speaking volumes about his character. He didn't press her with questions or pushed for answers about her past. Instead, he simply existed alongside her, offering his strength and presence without expectation. Over time, Angie began to see Chess not as a stranger, but as a part of her world. He spoke sparingly of the life he'd left behind, but when he did, Angie glimpsed a man shaped by loss and hardship. There was a quiet sadness in him, tempered by a resilience that matched her own. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Chess told her about Ed, how her husband had died saving his life. He spoke with reverence, acknowledging the debt he could never truly repay. Angie listened in silence, her emotions a turbulent mix of grief and gratitude. In Chess, she saw the strength she had always wanted in Ed, but never quite found. Yet there was no bittersweetness in her feelings, only a growing sense of connection to the man who had come into her life through such strange circumstances. The canyon, once a place of solitude and struggle, began to feel less like a prison and more like a home. Angie found herself laughing more, the sound foreign but welcome. The children thrived under Chess's quiet guidance, and the work that had once seemed insurmountable now felt manageable. As the weeks turned into months, the bond between Angie and Chess deepened. It wasn't spoken aloud, but it was there in every shared glance, every moment of unspoken understanding. One evening, as the stars spread across the canyon sky, Chess turned to Angie and said, almost to himself, "A man could get to like it here." Angie smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in years. For the first time in a long time, she felt the stirrings of hope, not just for survival, but something more. Our last story of tonight is called The Outcasts of Poker Flat by Bret Harte. This story was released in January of 1869, back when parts of the old American West were still alive and well. Here is The Outcasts of Poker Flat. The town of Poker Flat, a hard-scrabble settlement nestled in the Sierra Nevada foothills, was no stranger to vice. It thrived in the moral gray of the frontier, a place where fortunes were won and lost in smoky saloons, and life was as transient as the gold dust that fueled the dreams of its residents. But even Poker Flat, with its loose grasp on propriety, had its limits. By the morning of November 23, 1850, those limits had been reached. A string of thefts and a high-profile murder had rattled the town, leaving its citizens thirsty for justice, or vengeance. A secret committee convened in the dead of night, and when dawn broke, they handed down their verdict. The town must rid itself of its undesirable elements. The purge was swift. 2 men, deemed beyond redemption, were found hanging from a sycamore on the outskirts. For others, the punishment was exile. Among them was John Oakhurst, a gambler whose calm demeanor and sharp intellect had earned him both friends and enemies. Oakhurst stood in the street as the committee delivered its judgment. His handsome face betrayed no emotion, though he must have known his fate was sealed. The gambler's life had always been about playing the hand he was dealt, and today was no different. Without protest, he accepted the sentence and prepared to leave Poker Flat. But Oakhurst was not alone in his exile. The Duchess, a woman of fading beauty who had once turned heads but now turned whispers, was among the condemned. So too was Mother Shipton, a sharp-tongued woman whose past was as hard and weathered as her face. The final member of their group was Uncle Billy, a drunken ne'er-do-well whose loyalty was as fleeting as his sobriety. The four were escorted out of town under the watchful eyes of armed men. The warning was clear. Any attempt to return would mean death. The escort left them at the edge of the settlement, the last vestige of civilization disappearing behind them. The trail to get to Sandy Bar, a neighboring camp, wound through the rugged Sierra Nevadas. It was a hard journey even in the best conditions, and these were far from ideal. The autumn chill had given way to winter's bite, and the narrow path climbed steadily into the mountains. Oakhurst led the way, his gambler's instincts guiding his every step. Behind him, the Duchess struggled to maintain her composure, which was now sagging under the weight of exhaustion. Mother Shipton muttered curses under her breath, her anger masking the fear she refused to show. Uncle Billy, ever the opportunist, stumbled along the rear, his curses turning to slurred complaints as the liquor wore off. By the midday, the group had ascended into the high country, where the air was thin and the trees sparse. The Duchess, pale and trembling, declared that she could go no farther. With great drama, she slid from her mule and sank to the ground, refusing to move. Oakhurst surveyed the area. They had stopped in a natural amphitheater, the cliffs rising steeply on three sides. The spot offered shelter, but it was far from ideal. They were still hours from Sandy Bar, and Oakhurst knew that delays could be dangerous. But the others would not listen. Resigned, he helped set up camp. The ground had little in the way of supplies, but liquor flowed freely. It dulled their hunger and fatigue, and soon the Duchess and Mother Shipton were laughing together like old friends. Uncle Billy drank himself into a stupor, his snoring echoing through the canyon. Oakhurst, ever the outsider, stood apart from the revelry. He had never been one to dull his senses with drink. A gambler needed a clear head, and Oakhurst could not afford to lose his edge. Not here, not now. The next morning, as the outcasts prepared to continue their journey, a sound broke the stillness. A horse's hooves clattered against the rocky trail, and a figure emerged from the trees. It was Tom Simpson, a young man known in Poker Flat as the Innocent. Tom greeted Oakhurst with unabashed enthusiasm, his boyish grin shining through the dirt on his face. Months earlier, Oakhurst had beaten Tom in a card game, but had returned the boy's winnings, advising him to stay away from gambling. Now, Tom regarded Oakhurst as a hero, a mentor who could do no wrong. Tom wasn't alone. Riding beside him was Piney Woods, his fiancée. She was just 15, her cheeks flushed with excitement of their elopement. The pair had fled Piney's disapproving father, and were on their way to Poker Flat to start a new life. The arrival of the young lovers brought a spark of hope to the weary group. Tom's mule was laden with supplies, and his boundless optimism was contagious. Even the Duchess, whose jaded heart had grown long cold, found herself smiling at Piney's innocent chatter. That night, as the group huddled around the fire, the first flakes of snow began to fall. By morning, the world was unrecognizable. The trail was buried beneath drifts, and the path to Sandy Bar was lost. Oakhurst awoke to another grim discovery. Uncle Billy was gone, and so were their mules. The tracks leading away from camp told the story plainly enough, but Oakhurst chose to keep the truth to himself. The others didn't need to know they'd been betrayed. With no way to continue their journey, the group settled into an uneasy routine. Tom used the supplies he had brought to fortify the cabin, patching the roof with pine and building a crude windbreak. Piney's cheerful demeanor kept the group's spirits from sinking completely, and even Mother Shipton softened in her presence. As the days turned into weeks, the snow continued to fall. The group rationed their supplies carefully, but hunger gnawed at them all. The Duchess and Piney grew close, their unlikely friendship bridging the gap between their vastly different lives. Mother Shipton, who had once been the fiercest among them, began to fade, her strength sapped by the relentless cold and hunger. Each evening, the group gathered around the fire, sharing stories and songs. Tom entertained them with an accordion, and Piney's voice, though untrained, carried a sweetness that lifted their spirits. For a few hours each night, they forgot their dire circumstances and found solace in one another's company. By the 10th day, the group's rations were nearly gone. It was then that Mother Shipton made her final confession. She had been saving her food for Piney, ensuring that the young girl would have a chance to survive. With her strength failing, she called Oakhurst to her side and entrusted him with her secret. The next morning, Mother Shipton was gone. Oakhurst, ever stoic, buried her in the snow without ceremony. This would be Oakhurst's final gamble. Determined to save the young lovers, Oakhurst crafted a pair of crude snowshoes and handed them to Tom. He urged the boy to make the journey back to Poker Flat, knowing it was their only chance. As Tom prepared to leave, Oakhurst accompanied him to the edge of the canyon. "Take care of her," Oakhurst said simply. Then, with a nod, he turned back towards the cabin. The storm returned with a vengeance, battering the fragile cabin. Piney and the Duchess, huddled together for warmth, faced their fate with quiet resolve. When the fire finally died, they leaned on each other, their breaths mingling in the frigid air. When the storm cleared, a search party from Poker Flat arrived. They found the cabin buried in snow, its inhabitants frozen in a tableau of quiet repose. Piney and the Duchess lay together, their faces serene in death, their differences erased by the merciful touch of the storm. Further up the trail, beneath a towering pine, they found Oakhurst. He lay with a derringer by his side, a single bullet marking his final act. A note pinned to the tree above him bore the gambler's epitaph. "Beneath this tree lies the body of John Oakhurst, who struck a streak of bad luck on the 23rd of November, 1850, and handed in his checks on the 7th of December, 1850.